So the first thing about this is that we need to know that there's a basic tenet of life that says that all living things are going to need both an energy source and a carbon source. All living things require an energy source and a carbon source. Okay, and we can divide them based on which energy sources and carbon sources they have. So for instance, we talk about carbon source first. There are two possible places that something would get carbon. Okay, if we say that something is an autotroph, autotrophs are going to fix CO2 from the atmosphere. These are organisms that obtain carbon by fixing, that basically just means capturing, CO2 from the atmosphere. Okay, and those things that are not autotrophs then must be getting them from someplace else, and that is something that we call a heterotroph. The word autotroph means self-eater, meaning that it's getting the CO2 by itself, and the word heterotroph means other eater. Hetero means other. So these things are eating other organisms. Basically, they have to find either other heterotrophs or other autotrophs to get their carbon source. So these are organisms that obtain carbon by consuming organic compounds. Where did those organic compounds come from? They came from an autotroph at some point, right? So somewhere down the line there had to be an autotroph in order for there to be heterotrophs, right? Okay, those are the carbon sources. Now we've got our energy sources. And the two prefixes that you will see for energy sources are photo, which means energy from light, capturing energy from light, or chemo, which is capturing energy from chemicals, and those chemicals could be organic or inorganic, depending on the type of organism that you're looking for. Thank you. She's not here anymore. She dropped class today. Okay, so we can combine these terms then to talk about different stuff. So we can say that something is a photoautotroph, which means that it's going to get energy from sunlight and carbon from CO2. We could say that those are like plants, right? We could say something is a chemoheterotroph. That means that they're going to get their energy from organic molecules and also get their carbon from organic molecules. That's like me and you, right? We're chemoheterotrophs, right? But then there's also weird ones like photoheterotrophs that are going to capture energy from sunlight, but they can't fix CO2 directly. Those are pretty rare. And then there's also chemoautotrophs, which means that they can get energy from inorganic compounds like hydrogen sulfide or something like that, but then they're going to use CO2 as their energy source so that they can actually make their own food and they don't have to eat other things, right? So all kinds of different combinations. We are only going to focus today on the two biggest groupings, and that is photoautotrophs and chemoheterotrophs. Okay, let's start with photosynthesis. those organisms that are photoautotrophs are going to go through photosynthesis, and photosynthesis means capturing energy from sunlight in order to make sugars. Okay, so the process of capturing energy from sunlight and using it to make carbohydrates. And the basic formula for photosynthesis looks like this. It's 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O yields C6H12O6 plus 6 O2. Okay? And in order for this to happen, CO2 and H2O we say are fairly low energy molecules, whereas C6H12O6 is a pretty high energy molecule. You can't have low energy molecules create a high energy molecule unless you input some energy. So the energy has to come from somewhere. So we're going to say that sunlight is very important. So we're going to put sunlight over this thing like this, just to say that sunlight is the thing that's providing the energy. And the energy from sunlight is going to be transferred into this high energy molecule called glucose. And I promised you at the beginning of the year that I would never be disingenuous with you guys and teach you guys wrong stuff without telling you that I'm teaching you wrong stuff, right? So, this is wrong. Sort of. It's sort of just oversimplified because it's actually going to require 12 H2O and then it's going to produce 6 H2O. And so what they do is they just knock it off and they cancel it out. So since there's going to be 6 H2O on the right side and it's going to require 12 H2O, then they can just say like, okay, cross that one out and we'll cancel out 6. Okay. The other thing that's disingenuous here is that while you can make glucose in this form, that's only like a small fraction of the time that it's actually going to produce glucose. The thing that really gets produced here is a small sugar called G3P, and G3P is 3 carbons. And if you wanted to take 2 G3Ps and smash them together, you could create glucose if you wanted to, or you could create this other thing called glucose phosphate, which is much better. Glucose phosphate is going to have a phosphate group on it, and so if you wanted to combine glucose monomers together, you could use the energy from that phosphate group to combine them together without having to input any more energy, right? And so since you know like starch is made out of glucose monomers and cellulose is made out of glucose monomers, this is much better to have glucose phosphate because then you can immediately go on to create these other things that are needed in the plant, right? And that's not mentioned in this equation, but it's very important to know. Okay. Let's talk about the two processes here in photosynthesis. The first ones are called the light reactions, or sometimes called the light-dependent reactions. And they're called that because they can only happen if there is light present. The light reactions are going to capture energy from sunlight and then store that energy up in high-energy molecules. Captures energy from sunlight. And produces high energy molecules. The high energy molecules that are produced here are ATP, which we know what that is, and then this other one that is a high energy electron carrier that's called NADPH. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. You guys know that, right? NADPH is nicotinamine adenine dinucleotide phosphate. You don't need to know that. It is basically just a compound that's really good at holding on to 2 high energy electrons, right? That's all you need to know about it. Really good at holding on to these 2 high energy electrons, and then you can save them for later. All right? Now, you can see that this ATP is produced here. As we mentioned earlier in the year, this ATP cannot be used for anything other than this reaction, this photosynthesis reaction. It's earmarked. It's only used in that. If the plant wants ATP, it's got to get it through cellular respiration. Right? This is only used for making sugars. Let's talk about the Calvin cycle. Okay. Point of the Calvin cycle is to use the ATP and NADPH that were just made in order to make sugars. Using ATP and NADPH to produce G3P, okay, and then G3P can become glucose. 2G3P can make a glucose. Okay. Next, let's talk about cellular respiration. In cellular respiration, the idea behind this is that we want to take organic compounds, specifically glucose is the one that fits in the best to the equation. It's going to go through all the different steps, but it can also happen with other organic compounds, and we want to pull the energy out of there in order to make ATP. Okay, so this is using glucose and other organic compounds to produce ATP. And so the basic formula for this starts with glucose, C6H12O6 plus 6 O2, yields 6 CO2 plus 6 H2O. Okay, this is another one of those disingenuous equations here because this would lead you to believe that this process doesn't require any H2O, right? If you look at this, there's no H2O in the reactant side and it produces H2O. So you're like, oh, I don't need any H2O in my body because this is going to produce all of it. No, because there are, again, 6 H2Os over here and 12 H2Os over here, and so they just cancel out the 6 that are on that side. Okay. The other thing that is disingenuous about this is that there's C6H12O6 here. That would lead you to believe that the only time you can have cellular respiration is if you have glucose, right? But what we're going to learn is all the other molecules have other places, like you could take nucleotides and go through cellular respiration, but they just don't go through all the different steps. If you want to go through all 3 steps, you got to have glucose to start, okay? So, we said that this glucose here had all kinds of energy in it. And the CO2 and the H2O don't. So where does the energy go? Form to ATP, yeah. So we're going to put ATP up here above because it would be incorrect to put ATP as one of the products because we couldn't account for all the other molecules that are in ATP, right? But we just want to show here that the energy from the glucose is going to go into that ATP. Okay, let's look at the different steps here of cellular respiration. Step 1 is called glycolysis. And we'd say that glycolysis is the initial breakdown of glucose. Glycolysis is the oldest metabolic process on Earth. We know this because it is shared by all life. All life has the ability to go through glycolysis, and if it doesn't, it has lost that ability at some point, because we can still find some of the enzymes that would normally be present in an organism that goes through glycolysis. It's present in all life. It's the oldest thing, the oldest metabolic process. Okay? By breaking down glucose here, you are going to produce a couple of things. Okay, so we can say that it produces ATP, which is good, and it also produces NADH. Okay? We can sort of look at the ATP and say, okay, we're producing ATP. When can we use this ATP? Whenever we want. This ATP is for now. When can we use this NADH? That's for later. Right? They're saving it up. Next process is called the Krebs Cycle. It's called the Krebs Cycle because it was discovered by a guy named Hans Krebs. And unfortunately for Krebs, it is becoming more and more common to call this the citric acid cycle instead. Which is sad. He worked so hard. And this is just a further breakdown of glucose. And it produces ATP, which, do you remember earlier on in the year we said this was adenosine triphosphate? It's actually technically, again, not to be disingenuous with you guys, it's technically not ATP, it's GTP that gets made here, which is guanosine triphosphate. But it's just the same as ATP. It functions just the same. It does the same stuff, so it's not really that important. But I just didn't want you to see it later and be like, he said it made ATP and it says here GTP, right? It makes GTP. It also makes NADH, and it makes FADH2. FADH2 is another high energy electron carrier. All right. Last step of this is called the electron transport chain. Almost always abbreviated ETC. We say that the ETC takes their energy from our high energy electron carriers, which are NADH and FADH2, and it uses those to create a gradient, or to pump H+ ions into the intermembrane space. So this uses energy from NADH and FADH2 to pump H+ ions against the concentration gradient into the intermembrane space. That's the space in between the inner and outer membranes in the mitochondria. Okay, so this produces an H+ ion gradient, and now we use this process called chemiosmosis. Is the process of H+ ions flowing down their concentration gradient through ATP synthase in order to create ATP. Down a gradient through ATP synthase producing ATP. So again, we make a little bit of ATP in glycolysis, we make a little bit of ATP in Krebs cycle, and then we make a boatload of ATP in the electron transport chain. Okay, that's why the electron transport chain is so good, because it's extremely efficient in producing ATP, much more efficient than glycolysis is, much more efficient than Krebs cycle is. Last thing, these high energy electron carriers. Three of them that we've talked about today. NADPH, NADH, and FADH2. Okay, so these are molecules that gain electrons. Gaining electrons is reduction. GR, Leo the lion says GR, if you remember that from chemistry. There's also something about a lighthouse, but I don't know that one. Anybody know that one? No? Leo the lion says GR, right? That's like from chemistry about, yeah, losing electrons is oxidation, gaining electrons is reduction. Leo and GR, LEO and GER. You guys learned that one? Okay. But then there's another one about a lighthouse. Like, I don't know what that one is. I'll look it up later. All right. Anyways, so if you gain electrons, it's reduction. And then use those electrons later on. And can carry those electrons to other reactions. Okay? So, you got NADH. That carries 2 high energy electrons. And it's produced in Krebs and glycolysis. So those are both in cellular respiration. Then you got FADH2, which this is sometimes confusing to people. Why do you need 2 things? And it's even more confusing here. It carries 2 slightly lower energy electrons. It's produced in the Krebs cycle. So why do you need 2 molecules, first of all? And then second of all, why would you ever want FADH2 if the energy or in the electrons is lower? Well, we're talking about chemistry here. And in chemistry, when you produce a molecule, it requires energy of a certain level from those electrons, right? So if we start with glucose, it's just a really high energy molecule, and we start pulling electrons off of it and breaking it down into other things, we're going to pull those high energy electrons off and send them into NADH, right? We do that a couple of times. Now we've broken the molecule down to the point where it doesn't have a whole lot of high energy electrons left. And so we still want to get the electrons out of it, but they're not high energy electron, or not high energy enough to make NADH. So we still want to get them out, so we got to have another molecule that's slightly lower energy so we can still pull electrons out to use for later. So we use this other molecule called FADH2. Okay? All right. And the last thing here is the one that's for photosynthesis, and that is NADPH. And it's the highest energy of all the molecules here. It carries the 2 high energy electrons. And it's used to produce sugars. So where the other ones are used in the electron transport chain, these are only used to produce sugars. and we can say that it's produced in light reactions. So again, this is the basic overview, right? This is probably the level of cellular respiration and photosynthesis that you learned in bio honors, I would think. This is something close to this. And then we're gonna spend 2 weeks here and ramp it up a notch, right? You're gonna learn about all the intermediate reactions, and the great part about it is it's going to make way more sense because you're going to see what's actually happening on a molecular level, and then it's obvious what the outcome will be once you see what's happening on the molecular level. Okay? All right, that's it.